50,000 people, all singing the same words, without any prompting, without the band even playing. Just voices filling a stadium in the dark during a key change that everyone in the building already knows is coming. That is what Livin' on a Prayer does to a room. But the story behind that song is not a story about success. It is a story about a band that nearly broke apart before they ever got the chance to record it. A label ready to drop them. A band ready to quit. Creative partnerships fracturing under the weight of pressure and exhaustion. 5 young men from New Jersey who had come too far to give up, but weren't sure they had enough left to keep going. A record industry that had already written them off and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with the decision. And one album, recorded thousands of miles from home, that pulled them back from the edge and changed everything. How did that happen? Let's begin. New Jersey Dreams. The year is 1983. New Jersey is not the kind of place the music industry looks for its next big thing. It is a working-class state sitting in the shadow of New York City. Easy to overlook, easy to dismiss. But in a small recording studio in Sayreville,
a 21-year-old named John Bon Jovi is about to change that.
He has talked his way into studio time at the power station in New York, recorded a demo track called Runaway, and somehow gotten it placed on a local radio compilation album. Featuring unsigned New Jersey artists. What happens next surprises everyone, including John himself. The song gets airplay, real airplay. Listeners call in asking who this kid is. Mercury Records hears it and comes calling almost immediately. A record deal follows. Now John needs a band. He already has some pieces in place. Keyboard player David Bryan, drummer Tico Torres, bassist Alec John Such. But the missing piece, the one that would define the band's sound more than any other, arrives when a guitarist from Woodbridge named Richie Sambora walks into an audition. The chemistry between John and Richie is immediate and obvious to everyone in the room. Sambora could play with technical precision, but also with feel and personality. He wasn't just a guitarist, he was a co-writer, a creative partner, and a second voice. What sealed it was not just the playing, it was the way Richie listened. Most guitarists audition by showing everything they can do. Sambora showed what he could do for the song. That instinct, knowing when to lead and when to serve, is rarer than technical ability and worth far more in a band built around melody and hooks. Their first 2 albums, Bon Jovi in 1984 and 7,800 Fahrenheit in 1985, showed genuine promise, catchy songs, real energy, a clear commercial instinct, but they hadn't broken through the way Mercury Records needed them to. The label was watching, the clock was ticking, and the band knew it. The pressure builds. By 1985, the goodwill that comes with signing a promising new act was running out fast. Mercury Records had invested in Bon Jovi, and the returns were modest at best. 2 albums in, and the band was still playing mid-sized venues, still fighting for radio slots, still being lumped in with a crowded field of hair metal acts that all looked and sounded variations of the same thing. The pressure from the label was becoming impossible to ignore. Executives wanted a hit, not a promising single, not an album with a couple of decent tracks. A genuine commercial breakthrough that would justify the continued investment. Inside the band, the tension was equally real. John Bon Jovi had always been the driving force, the one with the clearest vision of where the band needed to go. That certainty, which was an asset in the early days, was beginning to create friction. Band members felt the creative space narrowing. Richie Sambora, whose musical instincts were sharp and whose contributions were substantial, was increasingly finding himself in creative arguments that left everyone frustrated. The exhaustion of constant touring was compounding everything. These were young men who had spent the better part of 2 years living out of suitcases, sleeping on buses, playing shows in half-empty rooms, hoping the next city would be different. That kind of grind wears people down in ways that are hard to explain to anyone who hasn't experienced it. There is also something specifically demoralizing about being almost successful. A band that never gets signed can console itself with the belief that the industry simply never discovered them. A band that gets signed, gets pushed, and still falls short has no such comfort. They had been given their shot, and it hadn't been enough. The question that nobody was saying out loud, but everyone was thinking, was simple and brutal. Were Bon Jovi actually good enough to make it? Or were they just another band the industry would chew through and forget? Hiring an outside producer, facing the very real possibility of being dropped by their label, Bon Jovi made a decision that would change everything. They were going to stop trying to figure it out themselves and bring in outside help. The producer they chose was Bruce Fairbairn, a Vancouver-based musician and producer who had a reputation for taking rock bands seriously and pushing them harder than they were comfortable with. Fairbairn was methodical, disciplined, and completely unimpressed by rock star attitude. He cared about songs and performances, nothing else. Alongside Fairbairn, they brought in Desmond Child, a professional songwriter who had already written hits for Kiss and other major acts. The decision to work with an outside songwriter did not go down easily inside the band. Richie Sambora, in particular, had reservations. Bringing in someone from outside felt like an admission that what they had wasn't good enough on its own. It felt like a compromise of their identity. But John pushed for it, and eventually the rest of the band came around, understanding that the alternative, another underperforming album, and a quiet exit from the label, was far worse than bruised pride. Recording moved to Little Mountain Sound Studios in Vancouver, thousands of miles from New Jersey and everything familiar. That distance turned out to be maybe exactly what the band needed. Away from their usual environments, their usual habits, their usual distractions, they were forced to focus entirely on the work. Vancouver gave them no excuse not to be serious, and for the first time, they were serious in the right way. The band nearly implodes. The Vancouver session started with energy and optimism, but it didn't take long for the cracks to appear. John and Richie, whose creative partnership was the engine of the band, began clashing in ways that went beyond normal disagreement. The exhaustion of years on the road, the pressure of knowing this album had to succeed, and the presence of outside collaborators all combined to create an atmosphere that was genuinely volatile. There were days in that studio where the tension was so thick that productive work felt impossible. Arguments would start over a single chord progression and escalate into something much larger and much more personal. John's insistence on control, which had always been a defining characteristic, felt suffocating to the other members under those conditions. There were serious conversations, the kind that happened quietly and away from the studio, about whether this was worth continuing. Jon Bon Jovi has spoken in interviews since about how close the band came to simply stopping during that period. Not a dramatic public breakup, just a quiet decision that enough was enough. What kept them together was not goodwill or affection, though both still existed beneath the tension. It was something more stubborn than that. Every member of that band knew, on some level, that they had not yet made the record they were capable of making. They had come close. They had shown enough on the first two albums to believe the potential was real. Walking away before proving it felt unacceptable. That shared conviction, fragile as it was, held everything together just long enough for something to break through. Slippery when wet is born. Livin' on a Prayer almost didn't exist. John, Richie, and Desmond Child were in a writing session that had already produced material when the chord progression that would become the song's foundation emerged almost accidentally. They built around it quickly, the way great songs sometimes come together when everyone in the room stops thinking too hard. The lyrics arrived with a clarity that surprised even the writers. Tommy works on the docks. Gina works the diner all day. Two ordinary people from a working-class world trying to hold their lives together on faith and stubbornness. It was the most honest thing Bon Jovi had ever written and it came from a band that was itself surviving on exactly that combination of faith and stubbornness. But early in the process, there was real doubt about whether the song belonged on the album at all. It felt different from their established sound. The talkbox introduction, Richie's distinctive guitar effect, gave it a texture that didn't fit neatly alongside their more straightforward rock material. John himself was uncertain. There were conversations about leaving it off entirely. What saved it was a decision that was almost unheard of in the music industry at the time. Fairbairn and John took rough mixes of the album's songs and played them to real teenagers at a shopping mall in New Jersey. Actual kids, not industry insiders or label executives, voted on which songs made the final cut. "Livin' on a Prayer" was one of the songs that got the strongest response. The people who were supposed to buy the record had already told them exactly what they needed to hear. The album cover, a wet garbage bag, was a deliberate statement. No glamour, no excess, just the music.
Slippery When Wet changes everything. Slippery When Wet was released in August 1986, and the response was not gradual.
It was immediate, and it was massive. You Give Love a Bad Name entered the charts like a battering ram, becoming the band's first #1 single in the United States. And announcing to everyone paying attention that something had changed. But it was "Livin' on a Prayer" that revealed the true scale of what the album was going to become. The song connected with people in a way that went far beyond the usual rock audience. Tommy and Gina were not rock and roll characters. They were real people living real lives. And millions of listeners recognized themselves in that story immediately. Radio programmers who might have been cautious about a hair metal band found themselves playing the song repeatedly simply because the audience demanded it. The album went to #1 in the United States and stayed there for 8 weeks. It became the best-selling album of 1987 worldwide. 3 singles all reached the top 5. The band that Mercury Records had been quietly preparing to drop was now the biggest rock act on the planet. But the impact went deeper than chart positions. Slippery When Wet changed the conversation about what arena rock could be about. Hair metal at its worst was pure escapist fantasy. Fast cars, beautiful women, consequence-free rebellion. Livin' on a Prayer was about struggle, about holding on, about two people deciding that love and determination were enough even when nothing else was going their way. That emotional authenticity was what separated Bon Jovi from their peers, and it is why those peers are mostly forgotten while Bon Jovi are still filling stadiums. Legacy and survival. Bon Jovi should have been a casualty of the early 90s. When grunge arrived and made everything that came before it seem suddenly ridiculous, almost every hair metal act that had dominated the previous decade simply evaporated. Warrant, Poison, Winger. The venues got smaller, the record deals dried up, and the world moved on without looking back. Bon Jovi survived when almost none of their peers did, and the reason comes directly back to Slippery When Wet, because that album had established them as something more than a genre act. They were a band that wrote about real people and real emotions, and that connection proved durable in a way that pure image and spectacle never could. The follow-up album New Jersey in 1988 produced 5 top 10 singles and proved the breakthrough was no accident. Then came the complications. John's solo project Blaze of Glory in 1990, a soundtrack for the film Young Guns 2, was a massive commercial success.
On the run, a six-gun lover, a gambling in the wind. Yeah!
That created genuine tension within the band about where the priority really lay. Richie Sambora's struggles with addiction over the years put further strain on a partnership that was always complicated beneath the surface. In 2013, Sambora departed mid-tour, quietly, and without full explanation, ending the original creative partnership that had defined the band's best work. The Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction came in 2018, a formal acknowledgement of a career that had outlasted almost every expectation. Decades after Slippery When Wet, Bon Jovi are still touring, still selling out arenas, still hearing tens of thousands of people sing Livin' on a Prayer back at them without any prompting. That song became a promise, and they kept it. Bon Jovi should have been a footnote, another band the industry tried, shrugged at, and moved on from. Instead, they made Slippery When Wet They wrote Tommy and Gina. They wrote about ordinary people refusing to give up at the exact moment they themselves were refusing to give up. That is not a coincidence. That is what great music does. It tells the truth about the people who made it, and 40 years later, the stadiums are still singing.